Have you ever wondered what it costs to be the responsible one in a family where effort and reward seem to exist in completely different universes? I learned the exact price on a sweltering Nashville afternoon in July 2015, standing in my parents' driveway watching my 23-year-old brother Marcus unwrap a gold citizen watch worth more than my monthly grocery budget, while the printout of my latest mortgage payment transfer sat folded in my purse like evidence I was too ashamed to share. The watch presentation happened with all the ceremony of a military decoration. My father, Robert Washington, cleared his throat and delivered a speech about how proud he was of Marcus for taking initiative around the house, for showing responsibility by mowing their lawn twice a month, for stepping up like a man to help maintain their property. My mother, Diane, beamed with radiant pride, taking pictures while Marcus posed with his new timepiece, the afternoon sun catching the gold face and sending sparkles across the freshly cut grass. "This is what happens when you show your family you care," my father announced, clapping Marcus on the shoulder with the kind of affection I'd been craving my entire 25 years. "Actions speak louder than words, son. You've earned this." The watch glinted as Marcus flexed his arm for another photo, his smile wide with satisfaction. He'd been mowing their lawn since April, a job that took him roughly 90 minutes every other Saturday and paid him with home-cooked dinners and parental approval that multiplied with each pass of the mower. I stood there in my Target sundress, feeling the weight of the secret I'd been carrying for 18 months pressing against my chest like a stone. 18 months of automatic transfers. 18 months of $1,847 leaving my checking account on the 15th of every month, sent directly to First Tennessee Bank to cover my parents' mortgage payment, while they praised my brother for basic lawn maintenance, and I lived on ramen noodles to ensure their house payment never missed a due date. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. Marcus's lawn mowing efforts, celebrated with jewelry and speeches, had earned him roughly 40 hours of actual work over 4 months. My mortgage payments, invisible and unacknowledged, represented 47 hours of overtime every single month, extra shifts at the corporate law firm where I managed case files until my eyes burned from fluorescent lights. While Marcus got thanked for keeping grass neat, I got bank notifications confirming that another chunk of my financial future had disappeared into their homeownership. Standing in that driveway, listening to my parents discuss how the watch would serve as a lasting reminder of Marcus's dedication, I calculated the mathematics of family appreciation. His 4 months of lawn care, roughly $300 worth of labor at standard landscaping rates. My 18 months of mortgage payments, $246 of my take-home salary, money that could have been invested, saved for my own home down payment, or used to build the kind of financial security that 25-year-olds are supposed to be establishing. The ratio felt like a joke with a punchline I was too dense to understand, but the real punchline came when my mother turned to me with that warm smile she reserved for family gatherings when she wanted everyone to feel included. "Zuri, honey, thank you so much for all your help too. We really appreciate everything you do for us." Everything I do. The phrase hung in the humid air like a question mark, because as far as they knew, I didn't do anything for them beyond showing up to dinners and remembering birthdays. The mortgage payments happened electronically, silently, without fanfare, because I'd set them up that way to preserve my parents' dignity when they'd fallen behind after my father's hours were cut. Thanks was what I got for sacrificing my financial independence to keep their house out of foreclosure. Thanks was my reward for living in a tiny apartment with a roommate while ensuring they could maintain their 3-bedroom ranch in Belmead. Thanks was apparently equivalent to 18 months of mortgage payments, while a gold watch was the appropriate response to summer lawn maintenance. The economics of family gratitude followed no logical system I could understand. As we walked into the house for the celebratory dinner my mother had prepared in Marcus's honor, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and saw someone I barely recognized. When had I become the person who absorbed financial emergencies without expecting acknowledgement? When had I started believing that my contributions only mattered if they remained invisible? And when had I become so grateful for crumbs of appreciation that thanks felt like enough compensation for rebuilding their entire financial foundation? Sitting at that dinner table, watching my family celebrate Marcus's initiative with a toast and his favorite chocolate cake, I had no idea that this moment would become the beginning of my awakening to the true cost of being indispensable to people who had convinced themselves that my sacrifices were simply part of my character, as natural as seasons changing. The watch glinting on my brother's wrist would become the symbol that finally helped me understand the difference between being valued and being used. The pattern became impossible to ignore once I started paying attention to how celebration was distributed in our family. 3 weeks after the watch ceremony, Marcos received a surprise party for landing a part-time job at Best Buy. Not a career position, not a promotion, but a 20-hour-per-week retail job that he'd gotten after one interview. My mother spent 2 days preparing his favorite foods. My father called relatives to share the good news, and they presented him with a new laptop for work and personal use that cost more than I made in 3 weeks of overtime shifts. Meanwhile, I'd been working 60-hour weeks for 6 months straight, pulling double duty between my regular administrative position and freelance data entry work that kept me hunched over my laptop until 2 a.m. most nights. The extra income wasn't for luxuries, it was to maintain the mortgage payments that had become as automatic as breathing, while also keeping my own rent current and my car insurance paid. But when I mentioned my exhaustion to my mother during our weekly phone calls, her response was advice about time management and suggestions for better multivitamins. The breaking point came during Marcus's Best Buy celebration dinner, when my father raised his glass of sweet tea and delivered another speech about work ethic and personal responsibility. "This is what happens when you apply yourself," he said, his voice carrying parental wisdom earned through decades of hard living. Marcos didn't just wait for opportunity. He went out there and created his own future. That's the kind of initiative that builds character and earns respect. I sat there pushing collard greens around my plate, calculating that Marcus's part-time retail position would gross him roughly $800 per month, while my mortgage payments to keep their house out of foreclosure were nearly twice that amount every month. But somehow, his $800 per month accomplishment warranted a party, a laptop, and multiple phone calls to extended family, while my ongoing financial sacrifice warranted advice about work-life balance and concerns about whether I was burning myself out for no good reason. The mathematics of recognition were becoming clearer, and they made no sense by any logical standard. Marcus's achievements, however small, were amplified and celebrated with material rewards and public acknowledgement. My contributions, however substantial, were absorbed silently into the family ecosystem like water disappearing into dry earth. I was beginning to understand that visibility mattered more than magnitude in our family's economy of appreciation, and that my choice to handle their financial crisis quietly had rendered my sacrifice invisible. But it was the conversation I overheard between my parents after dessert that finally cracked something open inside my chest. I'd gone to the kitchen to help with dishes when I heard my mother's voice drifting from the living room, where she and my father were discussing Marcus's future with the satisfaction of parents who'd successfully launched a child into independence. "I'm so proud of how he's turned his life around," she was saying, her voice warm with maternal pride. "Getting that job shows real maturity. He's finally becoming the man we raised him to be. Finally becoming the man we raised him to be." At 23, working part-time retail, still living at home while his sister paid their mortgage. Meanwhile, I'd been financially independent since 18, had never missed a rent payment or defaulted on a credit card, had sacrificed my own home ownership dreams to preserve their financial stability, and apparently none of that qualified as the kind of maturity worthy of recognition or pride. That night, sitting in my tiny apartment while my roommate watched Netflix, I opened my laptop and did something I'd been avoiding for months. I calculated the total amount I'd transferred to my parents' mortgage account since the crisis began. The number stared back at me from the spreadsheet like an accusation: $35,093. $35,000 of my income, earned through overtime shifts and weekend freelance work, quietly transferred to preserve their home ownership, while they celebrated Marcus for 40 hours of lawn care and a part-time retail job. The disproportion was so stark it felt surreal. I'd essentially bought them a new car's worth of financial stability, and they didn't even know I'd done it. Marcus had mowed their lawn 16 times and gotten a gold watch, a laptop, and a celebration dinner with extended family phone calls. The equation made no sense unless I accepted that my value to them was purely functional, that I existed to solve problems silently while they invested their emotional energy in celebrating Marcus's incremental steps toward basic adult responsibility. For the first time since this arrangement began, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if I stopped. What if the mortgage payments simply stopped? Would they figure out how to cover the difference themselves, or would they finally acknowledge what I'd been doing all along? The thought was both terrifying and liberating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and finally understanding that jumping might be less frightening than staying exactly where I was. The moment of clarity arrived on a Tuesday morning in December 2015, wrapped in the most ordinary circumstances imaginable. I was sitting at my desk at the law firm, processing client invoices and calculating how many extra freelance hours I'd need over Christmas break to cover both my parents' January mortgage payment and my own rent increase, when my phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus that changed everything. "Check out my new ride." The photo showed him leaning against a cherry red Honda Civic, keys dangling from his finger, his smile so wide it practically jumped off the screen. The car looked pristine, with temporary plates and that showroom shine that meant it had probably been driven off the dealer lot that morning. My first thought wasn't congratulations, it was confusion, because Marcus had been saving for a car for months without much success, working his part-time retail schedule and spending most earnings on video games and nights out. My phone rang before I could respond. "Zuri!" My mother's voice bubbled with excitement, breathless with news she couldn't contain. "Have you seen Marcus's pictures? Your father and I surprised him with a car this morning. He's been working so hard at Best Buy, and we wanted to show him how proud we are of his responsibility and dedication. Plus, now he can get to work more easily and maybe pick up extra shifts." The words hit me like cold water. They'd bought Marcus a car. Not helped with a down payment, not co-signed a loan, but purchased a vehicle outright as a reward for 6 months of part-time retail work. While I'd been living on peanut butter sandwiches and instant coffee to afford their mortgage payments, they'd somehow found the resources to buy their adult son a brand new Honda Civic because he'd shown up to Best Buy consistently. "Mom," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady while my hands shook around my coffee mug, "that's wonderful, but how did you afford a new car right now? I thought things were still tight financially." The question felt dangerous, like probing a wound everyone had agreed to pretend didn't exist. But I had to know how they'd managed to find thousands of dollars for Marcus, while I'd been covering their most basic housing expense for nearly 2 years. There was a pause, the kind of silence that fills with all the things people don't want to say out loud. "Well," she finally said, her voice losing some excitement, "your father got a bonus at work, and we've been saving a little here and there. We figured it was time to invest in Marcus's future, help him get established. You know how important it is for a young man to have reliable transportation." A bonus. They'd gotten a bonus and spent it on a car for Marcus while I continued to pay their mortgage. The logic was so twisted it made my head spin. They had extra money, enough to purchase a vehicle, but they'd never mentioned reducing my financial contribution or even acknowledging that my contribution existed. Instead, they'd used their windfall to reward Marcus for behavior that should have been expected rather than celebrated, while continuing to accept my sacrifice as natural as sunrise. That afternoon, I drove to Belle Meade to see the car for myself. I told myself I was being supportive, but really I needed to confirm this was actually happening, that my family had actually found money for luxury purchases while I sacrificed my own financial stability for their basic needs. The Honda sat in their driveway like a red flag, literally and figuratively. It was beautiful, the kind of reliable, attractive vehicle any 23-year-old would be thrilled to own. Marcus was washing it with reverent care when he saw me, his face lighting up with genuine joy that made me feel terrible for the resentment burning in my chest. "Isn't she gorgeous?" he said, running the chamois over the hood with reverent care. "Mom and Dad said they wanted to surprise me because I've been doing so well at work. The manager even mentioned that I might get promoted to full-time after the holidays." His pride was infectious and heartbreaking simultaneously, because he genuinely believed he'd earned this recognition through his own efforts, with no awareness of the financial foundation I'd been providing. Standing there watching my brother celebrate a gift that had been funded indirectly by my sacrifice, I finally understood what had been bothering me about the watch ceremony months earlier. It wasn't jealousy. It was recognition that I'd been enabling a system where Marcus received credit and rewards for minimal effort, while I received neither for maximum effort. By handling their financial crisis invisibly, I'd allowed them to maintain the illusion that they were stable enough to be generous, when in reality they were only generous because I was covering their basic obligations. The red Honda Civic wasn't just a car. It was proof that my family had been living a lie, and I'd been making that lie possible. The confrontation happened on Christmas Eve, which wasn't intentional, but felt symbolically perfect in the most devastating way possible. I'd spent 3 weeks building my case, compiling bank statements and calculating totals, preparing for a conversation that would either repair our family relationships or destroy them entirely. I arrived carrying a carefully wrapped gift for Marcus and a manila folder containing 2 years of mortgage payment documentation that sat in my car like a loaded weapon. The house looked more elaborate than usual. Professional garland draped along the staircase, a 9-foot tree covered in new ornaments, packages wrapped with expensive ribbon from specialty stores rather than dollar section at Target. Marcus was in the living room showing our cousin David his latest achievement, an Employee of the Month certificate in a decorative frame. "Check this out," Marcus was saying. "I got promoted to full-time at Best Buy and they gave me this award. Mom and Dad were so proud they took me out to that new steakhouse downtown to celebrate. Dad said it was the first time in years he'd seen me really apply myself to something." The irony was sharp enough to taste. Employee of the Month at Best Buy had earned Marcus dinner at a restaurant that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Meanwhile, I'd been Employee of every month for 2 years straight in the unpaid position of Family Mortgage Coordinator. And my reward had been the privilege of working overtime to continue funding their lifestyle. But it was my father's dinner speech that finally broke my restraint. Mellowed by wine and holiday sentiment, he started reminiscing about how proud he was of both his children and how well we'd turned out, despite financial struggles over the past few years. "It's been tough," he said, voice carrying vulnerability. "But we've managed to keep our heads above water and even help you kids when you needed it. That's what family is about, supporting each other through hard times. Supporting each other through hard times." The phrase echoed while I watched Marcus nod along, his new watch catching tree lights, his car keys sitting casually on the coffee table next to his Employee of the Month certificate. He had no idea that his parents' ability to support him had been entirely dependent on their daughter's invisible financial contributions. "Dad," I said, setting down my fork with surprising steadiness, "can I ask you something? When you say you've managed to keep your heads above water, what exactly do you mean?" The question hung like a challenge, and I watched my parents exchange the kind of quick glance that passes between people who share an uncomfortable secret. "Well," my father said carefully, "we've managed to keep up with all our bills, keep the house, maintain our lifestyle. It hasn't been easy, but we've made it work." His words were technically true and completely misleading simultaneously, acknowledging reality while obscuring the most important facts. That's when I excused myself, retrieved the manila folder from my car, and returned to place it on the table between the centerpiece and my mother's good china, my hands trembling with rage and terror that made my voice shake. "I need to show you all something," I said, opening the folder to reveal bank statements highlighted in yellow mortgage payment confirmations, arranged chronologically, and a summary sheet calculating the devastating total. "For the past 22 months, I've been paying your mortgage. Not helping, paying your entire monthly housing payment, $1,847 every month, automatically transferred from my checking account to First Tennessee Bank." The silence was so complete, I could hear Christmas music playing softly in the background, some cheerful song about family togetherness that suddenly felt like mockery. Marcus stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language, while my parents sat frozen, caught between denial and acknowledgement. "The total amount," I continued, my voice growing stronger as truth finally escaped, "is $40,634. $40,000 of my income, earned through 60-hour work weeks and freelance projects that kept me awake until 3 a.m., transferred directly to preserve your home ownership while you celebrated Marcus for mowing the lawn and working part-time retail." My mother's face had gone pale, her hand reaching toward the documents as if she could make them disappear. Zuri, honey, we didn't ask you to. You didn't ask, I interrupted. But you set up the automatic transfer. You had access to my banking information from when I lived here during college, and you used it to arrange payments without my explicit consent. For nearly 2 years, you've been living on my income while praising Marcus for basic adulting and buying him cars with money you could afford because I was covering your biggest expense. The room exploded into chaos, my father demanding to know how I could accuse them of theft, my mother crying about misunderstandings, Marcus asking confused questions. But through all the noise, one fact remained crystal clear. They'd known. They'd known where the money was coming from, and they'd chosen to celebrate Marcus's minimal contributions while treating mine as invisible and automatic. The watch cost more than I spend on food in 2 months. The car cost more than I've saved for emergencies. All of it was funded by money you could afford because you weren't spending your own money on housing. Standing in that dining room, holding evidence of nearly 2 years of unacknowledged support, I finally understood this wasn't about money. It was about recognition, respect, and whether my contributions mattered enough to be acknowledged. The answer apparently was no. 5 years later, I'm writing this from the home office of my own house. Not an apartment, not a rental, but a 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow in East Nashville that I purchased entirely with money I was finally able to save once I stopped funding other people's financial stability. The mortgage payment is $1,240 per month, exactly $600 less than what I'd been paying for my parents' house, and every month when I write that check, I remember the woman I used to be who thought her worth was measured by how much she could sacrifice without asking for recognition. The immediate aftermath of that Christmas Eve confrontation was brutal and necessary in equal measure. My father demanded repayment for the emotional damage of my accusations, as if documenting their use of my money constituted family betrayal. My mother oscillated between tearful apologies and defensive justifications, insisting they'd always planned to reimburse me, but had never found the right time to discuss it. Marcus, to his credit, was genuinely horrified when he understood the full scope of what had been happening, and he offered to return the car, the laptop, even the watch, gestures that were touching but ultimately symbolic. But the transformation that followed was worth every uncomfortable conversation and strained relationship. Within 3 months of stopping the mortgage payments, I'd accumulated enough savings to put a down payment on my own home. Within 6 months, I'd been promoted to Senior Administrative Coordinator at the law firm, a position that came with a $15,000 salary increase and recognition for the organizational skills I'd been developing while managing 2 households' worth of financial obligations. The competence I'd been exercising in my personal life finally became visible in my professional life. Marcus and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, with conversations that were painful but honest about how family dynamics had shaped both our expectations and behaviors. He came to understand that his achievements, while genuine, had been amplified by circumstances he hadn't recognized, and he began making choices that reflected a more accurate understanding of his own capabilities and responsibilities. The watch still sits in his jewelry box, but he rarely wears it now, not out of shame, but because it represents a version of himself he's outgrown. My parents required more time and distance to process what had happened. The loss of my mortgage payments forced them to confront their actual financial situation, and they eventually sold the Belmead house for something more affordable in a different neighborhood. The downsizing was difficult for them, But it was also liberating. They no longer had to maintain appearances they couldn't afford, and they no longer had to live with the cognitive dissonance of accepting help they couldn't acknowledge. The relationship we have now is more honest, if less frequent. Holiday dinners happen at my house now, where I control the guest list and conversation topics. My parents visit with genuine appreciation for the hospitality I provide, and Marcos brings dessert and helps with cleanup without being asked. The dynamic is healthier because it's based on what people actually contribute rather than what they've always expected to receive. But the most profound change has been in my own understanding of what family relationships should look like. I learned that love without respect is incomplete, that generosity without acknowledgement becomes enabling, and that preserving other people's comfort at the expense of your own dignity isn't noble, it's self-destructive. The woman who paid her parents' mortgage while living on peanut butter sandwiches thought she was being selfless, but she was actually participating in a system that devalued her contributions while overvaluing everyone else's minimal efforts. My house is filled with things I chose and purchased with money I earned and kept for myself. Furniture that reflects my taste, artwork that makes me happy, a piano I'm learning to play because I finally have time for hobbies that don't generate income. The guest room is available for family visits, but it's not a permanent solution to anyone else's housing crisis. My savings account grows every month instead of being depleted, and my investment portfolio reflects the kind of long-term planning that becomes possible when you're not constantly transferring your financial future to preserve someone else's present. Last month, Marcus called to tell me he'd been promoted to assistant manager at a different retail chain, a position he'd earned through genuine effort rather than family subsidies. His excitement was infectious and completely different from the pride I remembered from his Best Buy celebrations. It was the confidence of someone who knew he'd achieved something through his own work. "I wanted to tell you first," he said, "because you're the one who taught me what real responsibility looks like. Oh, what would your life look like if you stopped accepting less recognition than your contributions deserve? The family dynamics that feel permanent are often just patterns we've been afraid to challenge, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable behaviors that diminish your worth while inflating someone else's sense of entitlement.